June 6th, 1944. Juno Beach, Normandy, France. The cold ocean spray hit the faces of 14,000 Canadian soldiers as their landing craft bobbed in 10-foot waves. It was 7:45 in the morning. Through the thick fog and smoke, they could see the gray concrete bunkers of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. German machine guns were already firing. Tracer bullets lit up the morning sky like deadly fireflies. The Canadians were about to hit the most heavily defended beach of the entire D-Day invasion. Major General Rod Keller stood on the command ship, watching his men approach the killing zone. He knew the numbers. 21,000 German defenders waited behind those concrete walls. Mines covered the beach, barbed wire stretched in thick tangles. Artillery guns pointed straight at the waterline. Every expert said this would be a bloodbath, and Keller knew they might be right. 2 years earlier, the Canadians had tried to assault the French coast at a place called Dieppe. That operation followed all the rules. It used the standard amphibious assault doctrine that military academies taught. The commanders were careful. They were methodical. They followed the textbook. And 68% of the Canadian soldiers became casualties. More than half the force was killed, wounded, or captured in just 9 hours. The memory of Dieppe hung over every Canadian who now approached Juno Beach like a dark cloud. The conventional wisdom was clear. When attacking a fortified beach, you moved slowly. You waited 3 minutes between waves of troops. You let each group establish positions before sending the next. You were cautious. You were careful. You minimized risk. This is what the manual said. This is what the experts taught. And at Dieppe, following these rules had led to disaster. But the problem was even bigger now. The German defenses at Juno Beach were far stronger than they had been at Dieppe. Intelligence reports showed concrete bunkers 8 feet thick. The Germans had 88mm guns that could punch through tank armor. They had mortars, machine guns, and rifle positions covering every inch of sand. They had spent 4 years building these defenses. They called it the Atlantic Wall, and they believed it was unbreakable. American and British commanders looked at the Canadians with doubt. Many called them colonial troops. They said the Canadians lacked real combat experience. Some American officers whispered that the Canadians should have been given an easier sector. But by the end of this day, those same American generals would be saying something very different when they watched the Canadians fight. The British commanders were polite but skeptical. They had seen what happened at Dieppe. They wondered if the Canadians were ready for this. Rod Keller was not what anyone expected in a major general. He was 42 years old and had spent most of his career in unglamorous positions. He was not from a famous military family. He had not graduated at the top of his class. Other generals wore their medals and spoke in grand strategic terms. Keller was blunt, he was practical, and he had learned something from Dieppe that the textbooks did not teach. The problem, Keller realized, was not that the Canadians had been too aggressive at Dieppe. The problem was that they had not been aggressive enough. They had followed the slow, methodical approach. They had paused. They had tried to consolidate. And while they paused, the Germans had cut them to pieces. The kill zone on a beach is not a place to be careful. It is a place to run through as fast as possible. Keller spent months studying the Dieppe disaster. He talked to survivors. He looked at the timing. He realized something that challenged everything the military establishment believed. The most dangerous place on a beach assault is not the waterline. It is the zone between the waterline and the enemy fortifications. That zone is where the Germans have perfect firing angles. That zone is where soldiers are most exposed. And the longer you stay in that zone, the more men you lose. His conclusion was radical. Instead of 3-minute intervals between waves, he wanted 30-second intervals. Instead of letting troops bunch up and consolidate, he wanted them to keep moving forward. Instead of caution, he wanted speed. Instead of following doctrine, he wanted momentum. When Keller presented his plan to Allied headquarters, the response was immediate resistance. American advisors said it violated basic amphibious assault principles. British observers said it would cause chaos. The troops would bunch up, they warned. The formations would break down. It would be a disaster worse than Dieppe. But Keller had one crucial supporter. Admiral Percy Nellis, the head of the Royal Canadian Navy, believed in the plan. Nellis had also studied Dieppe. He had also seen the conventional approach fail. He used his influence to let Keller train his troops in this new aggressive method. For 6 months, the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division practiced. They practiced moving fast. They practiced ignoring the instinct to take cover. They practiced pushing forward even when it felt wrong. The soldiers knew this approach was different. Some were scared. Some thought it was crazy. But they trusted Keller, and they remembered Dieppe. Now, as the landing craft approached Juno Beach, Keller watched the first wave hit the sand. It was 7:55 in the morning. The German guns opened up with everything they had. The sound was deafening. Explosions threw up towers of sand and water. Machine gun fire created a solid wall of bullets. Men fell. But the Canadians did not stop. They did not pause. They pushed forward through the smoke and fire. 30 seconds later, the next wave hit the beach. Then another. Then another. Keller stood on the command ship and watched his theory become reality. Everything depended on the next few minutes. Either his insight was correct, or he had just sent 14,000 men into a meat grinder worse than Dieppe. The technical details of Keller's plan went against everything the military manuals taught. Standard doctrine said landing waves should be spaced 3 minutes apart. This gave troops time to establish defensive positions and gave commanders time to assess the situation. Keller's modified assault formations cut that time to 30 seconds. The boats would come in almost on top of each other. The beach would flood with men in one continuous stream instead of careful separated groups. On paper, it looked like madness. In practice, it would mean the Germans could not focus their fire on isolated groups of soldiers. The Canadians had another advantage that morning. They brought 80 specialized tanks called Hobart's Funnies. These were not regular tanks. Some had large rotating drums on the front that detonated mines. Others had huge bundles of logs they could drop into ditches to create bridges. Some had flamethrowers. Others had massive mortars. The Canadians had more of these specialized vehicles than any other beach on D-Day. The American commanders had refused most of them for Omaha and Utah beaches, calling them unnecessary. The Canadians took everything they could get. The lead Canadian units, the Regina Rifles and the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, hit the sand at the small town of Courcelles-sur-Mer at exactly 8 o'clock. The waves were the highest of any landing beach that day. 10-foot swells tossed the landing craft like toys. Several boats capsized before reaching shore. Men weighted down with 60 pounds of equipment struggled in the cold water. But those who made it to the beach did not stop. They ran forward. The specialized tanks rolled off their landing craft and immediately went to work. The mine-clearing tanks moved ahead, their drums spinning and exploding the buried mines. Behind them came the regular tanks, firing at the concrete bunkers. Then came the flamethrower tanks shooting streams of fire into the German positions. The infantry followed right behind, moving through the paths the tanks created. It was organized chaos, but it was working. At 8:15, just 30 minutes after the first landing, forward scouts sent back a stunning report. The Canadians had penetrated 2 miles inland. This was unheard of. At Omaha Beach, American troops were still pinned down at the waterline. At Utah Beach, the Americans had barely moved past the seawall. But the Canadians were already pushing into the French countryside. American military advisors watching from the command ships could not believe what they were seeing. They sent urgent messages warning that the Canadians were moving too fast. They said the formations would break down. They said the troops would get cut off. They said this violated every principle of amphibious warfare. But the messages went ignored. The Canadians kept pushing forward. The key to the success was the continuous momentum. German machine gunners found it almost impossible to target effectively. As soon as they aimed at one group of soldiers, another group was already past them. The 30-second spacing meant the beach was never empty, but also never crowded. It was like a river of troops flowing steadily inland. The Germans had prepared for isolated groups they could destroy one at a time. They had not prepared for this unstoppable flood. By 8:30, exactly 45 minutes after the first landing, Canadian engineers had cleared 6 separate paths through the German defenses. They used Bangalore torpedoes to blow up barbed wire. They threw satchel charges into bunkers. They marked the safe paths with white tape. More troops poured through. The specialized tanks had done their job. 70% of the German fortifications in the immediate landing zone were already destroyed or abandoned. Admiral Percy Nels watched from his ship with a grim smile. He had fought hard to get approval for this plan. British admirals had called it reckless. American generals had said it would fail. But Nels had studied the same reports Keller had studied. He had reached the same conclusions. Speed was survival. Hesitation was death. Now, watching the Canadians surge inland, he knew he had been right to support Keller. The Canadians were using only 50% of the landing craft assigned to the American sectors. They had fewer boats, fewer men in the first waves, and a shorter timeline. But they were achieving faster results than anyone had predicted. The resource constraints that should have slowed them down had instead forced them to be more efficient. Every boat counted. Every minute mattered. There was no room for waste or delay. At 9 o'clock, the Regina Rifles reached the center of Courseulles-sur-Mer. The town had strong German defenses. Concrete bunkers covered the streets. Snipers hid in buildings. Machine gun nests protected every intersection. The conventional approach would have been to surround the town and slowly clear it, building by building. The Regina Rifles did not do that. They charged straight through the main street, tanks firing, infantry running behind. The Germans, shocked by the speed and aggression, began to surrender. The sound was incredible. The roar of tank engines mixed with the crack of rifle fire. Explosions echoed off stone buildings. German artillery shells screamed overhead. The smell of cordite and burning wood filled the air. Dust and smoke made it hard to see more than 50 feet. But the Canadians kept moving. Officers shouted orders. NCOs pushed men forward. Nobody stopped. By 9:30, 90 minutes after the first landing, something remarkable happened. The German 716th Infantry Division, which was defending this sector, began to collapse. Individual soldiers surrendered, then squads, then entire platoons. The continuous Canadian assault gave them no time to regroup or reorganize. Every time they tried to establish a new defensive line, Canadian tanks and infantry were already on top of them. The first real-world measurement of success came at 10 o'clock. Canadian forward positions were now 5 miles inland. They had broken completely through the Atlantic Wall. They had captured or destroyed more than 200 German fortifications, and their casualties, while significant, were running at about half of what the planners had predicted. The aggressive approach that everyone said would cause massive losses was actually saving lives. At 10:30, engineers began setting up temporary bridges over the Sulz River. This river ran behind Juno Beach and was supposed to be a major obstacle. The Germans expected it to slow any Allied advance for at least a full day. The Canadians reached it in under 3 hours. The specialized bridge-laying tanks moved into position. Within 40 minutes, infantry and regular tanks were crossing. By 11 o'clock in the morning, 21,400 Canadian troops had landed on Juno Beach. The sector that was supposed to be the hardest had become a breakthrough point. The sector that American commanders had worried about was now advancing faster than any other Allied force, and watching from their command posts, American and British generals were starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, the Canadians knew something they did not. The statistics that came in throughout the day told an incredible story. Pre-invasion planners had predicted that Juno Beach would see casualty rates similar to Dieppe. They expected somewhere between 60 and 70% losses in the first wave. The actual numbers were drastically different. By noon, Canadian casualties were running at approximately half of what had been predicted, around 30 to 35%, instead of the expected 60 to 70%. Men were still dying. Men were still being wounded. War is never clean or easy. But the aggressive momentum that military experts said would cause a bloodbath was actually saving lives. The contrast with other beaches became clear as the day went on. At Omaha Beach, American forces were still struggling to move past the seawall at noon. They had advanced roughly 5 miles by the end of the day. At Utah Beach, the Americans pushed about 6 miles inland. At Gold and Sword Beaches, the British forces made good progress but stayed relatively close to the coast. The Canadians at Juno Beach advanced 9 miles inland by the time darkness fell. They had penetrated deeper into France than any other Allied force on D-Day. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the full scale of Canadian success was becoming apparent to everyone watching. American General Omar Bradley stood on the deck of the USS Augusta, his command ship, with binoculars pressed to his eyes. He was watching the Canadian sector. Bradley was one of the most experienced American commanders. He had planned operations in North Africa and Sicily. He knew amphibious warfare, and he was watching something he had never seen before. Bradley lowered his binoculars and turned to his staff officers. The scene he had just witnessed seemed impossible. Canadian troops were not just holding their beachhead. They were racing inland. Their tanks were already disappearing into the French countryside. Supply vehicles were moving freely on the beach. The Germans were retreating. Bradley shook his head slowly. He had been skeptical of the Canadian plan. He had thought their aggressive approach was naive. Now he was not so sure. One of Bradley's colonels, a man named James Rudder, spoke quietly. The exact words were later recorded in military documents. Rudder said to his staff, "The Canadians fight like they've got something to prove." It was meant as an observation, not an insult, but it touched on something important. The Canadians did have something to prove. They had been dismissed as colonial troops. They had suffered through Dieppe. They carried the weight of being underestimated, and that weight had transformed into fuel. The sounds of battle had changed by early afternoon. In the morning, the beach had been filled with the thunder of naval guns and the constant rattle of machine gun fire. Now, the heavy firing was moving inland. You could hear it in the distance, growing fainter. On the beach itself, the sounds were different. Bulldozers clearing obstacles, engineers shouting instructions, landing craft engines bringing in more supplies. The beach had transformed from a battlefield into a supply depot in less than 6 hours. The smell had changed too. The sharp, chemical smell of explosives was fading. Now there was salt air from the ocean, mixed with diesel fuel from the vehicles, and the earthy smell of churned-up sand. Medics moved among the wounded. Chaplains said prayers over the dead. But the flow of troops and supplies never stopped. Wave after wave of reinforcements came ashore, and each wave moved immediately inland. At 2 o'clock, something unprecedented happened. A German officer approached Canadian lines under a white flag. He was a major in the 716th Infantry Division. Through an interpreter, he said he wanted to discuss terms. The Canadian commander he met with was surprised. Surrender negotiations usually took days. The major explained that his entire regiment, more than 800 men, wanted to surrender. They had been overwhelmed by the Canadian assault. They had never seen such aggression, he said. They had fought British and American forces before. But this was different. The Canadians attacked like men possessed. The German major's surrender was not an isolated incident. Throughout the afternoon, German units across the Juno sector began giving up. By 3 o'clock, more than 2,000 German soldiers had surrendered to Canadian forces. Entire defensive positions were being abandoned. The 716th Infantry Division, which was supposed to hold the coast for days, was falling apart in hours. British forces on the neighboring beaches noticed the Canadian success and tried to adjust their tactics. But it was not easy to change plans in the middle of a battle. The British had trained for months using conventional methods. Their officers knew those methods. Their soldiers expected those methods. Trying to suddenly adopt Canadian-style aggressive momentum caused confusion in some units. It worked better when British commanders simply told their troops to keep up with the Canadians pushing on their flanks. German commanders were desperately trying to counter the Canadian breakthrough. They sent in their reserve forces. The 21st Panzer Division, equipped with powerful tanks, moved toward the Juno sector. But the German tanks ran into a problem. The Canadians had already pushed so far inland that the panzers could not establish good defensive positions. Instead of fighting from prepared locations, the Germans had to attack while moving. And moving attacks against dug-in infantry with tank support rarely went well. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 340 of the 574 fortified German positions in the Canadian sector had been neutralized. Some were destroyed by Canadian tanks or artillery. Some were captured by infantry assaults. Some were simply abandoned when German troops retreated. The Atlantic Wall, which Hitler had boasted was impregnable, had a 9-mile-wide hole punched through it. The sky began to clear in the late afternoon. The clouds and smoke that had covered the battlefield all morning started to break up. For the first time, you could see clearly across the landscape. Canadian soldiers looked back toward the beach and saw an incredible sight. The ocean was filled with ships as far as the eye could see. Hundreds of landing craft moved back and forth. The beach itself was covered with vehicles, supplies, and troops, and stretching inland were columns of Canadian soldiers and tanks pushing deeper into France. One unexpected consequence of the Canadian success became clear around 5 o'clock. The rapid advance had created supply problems. The logistics officers had planned for a slower, more methodical push inland. They expected troops to still be near the beach at the end of D-Day. Instead, forward Canadian units were 9 miles away. Getting ammunition, food, and medical supplies to them required quick adaptation. Trucks that were supposed to arrive the next day had to be pressed into service immediately. Supply lines that should have taken a week to establish had to be created in hours. Another unexpected result involved French civilians. The rapid Canadian advance meant they reached French towns and villages much faster than planned. In places like Courseulles-sur-Mer, Bernières-sur-Mer, and Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, French people who had lived under German occupation for 4 years suddenly found themselves liberated on the very first day. They poured into the streets. They brought out hidden French flags. They offered wine and food to Canadian soldiers. The scenes of joy were not supposed to happen until days or weeks after D-Day, but the Canadian speed had changed the timeline. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the sun was getting lower in the sky. The long June day was finally winding down. Canadian soldiers began to dig in for the night. They had been fighting for more than 10 hours. They were exhausted. Many had not eaten since before dawn, but they held positions 9 miles from the beach. They had achieved something that military experts said was impossible. They had broken through the Atlantic Wall using methods that violated conventional doctrine. And in doing so, they had forced the entire Allied command to reconsider everything they thought they knew about amphibious warfare. The impact of what happened at Juno Beach did not end when the sun set on June 6, 1944. In the days and weeks that followed, military commanders across the Allied forces began to study what the Canadians had done. Staff officers requested detailed reports. Training instructors asked for tactical breakdowns. The aggressive momentum approach that had been dismissed as reckless before D-Day was now being examined as potential doctrine. Within 2 weeks of the landing, British units began incorporating elements of the Canadian tactics into their own operations. When the Allies pushed toward Caen, British commanders told their troops to maintain forward pressure. Do not pause to consolidate unless absolutely necessary, the orders said. Keep the Germans off balance. The lessons of Juno Beach were spreading through the Allied armies like ripples in a pond. American forces took longer to adapt, but they too began to change. By July 1944, American training manuals were being rewritten. The sections on amphibious assault were modified. The old guidance about 3-minute spacing between waves was questioned. New emphasis was placed on momentum and speed. Officers who had criticized the Canadian approach now studied it carefully. Some admitted they had been wrong. Others simply adopted the tactics without acknowledging where they came from. By August, as Allied forces broke out from Normandy and raced across France, the aggressive Canadian style of warfare had become common throughout the armies. Units that kept moving, that maintained pressure, that refused to let the enemy regroup, consistently performed better than units that followed the old cautious methods. The transformation was remarkable. What had been considered reckless in June was standard practice by September. The formal recognition of the Canadian tactics came in 1946. Military academies in both America and Britain updated their curriculum. Fort Benning in the United States and Sandhurst in England both began teaching what instructors called momentum doctrine. They did not always call it the Juno Beach method. Sometimes they used other names, but the core principles came directly from what the Canadians had proven on D-Day. Speed through the danger zone, continuous pressure, never give the enemy time to reorganize. Major General Rod Keller, the man who had developed and championed these tactics, did not live to see this recognition. On July 8, 1944, just over a month after D-Day, Keller was seriously wounded during the battle for Caen. A German artillery shell exploded near his command post. Shrapnel tore through his leg and back. He was evacuated to England and spent months in the hospital. His combat command was over. When Keller finally recovered enough to travel, he returned to Canada. The war in Europe was still raging, but Keller's fighting days were done. He was given administrative positions. He attended ceremonies. He gave speeches, but he was not leading troops anymore. The injury had ended his field career at the moment of his greatest triumph. In the immediate years after the war, Keller received surprisingly little public recognition. Canada celebrated its D-Day veterans, of course. There were parades and medals and monuments. But Keller himself faded into the background. He was not a charismatic speaker. He did not write memoirs. He did not seek publicity. Many Canadians knew the story of Juno Beach, but did not know the name of the general who had planned the tactics that made it successful. It was American commanders who first began to publicly credit Keller and the Canadian approach. In 1948, Omar Bradley published his war memoirs. In them, he devoted several pages to what he witnessed at Juno Beach. Bradley admitted that he had been skeptical of the Canadian methods before D-Day. He described watching through binoculars as the Canadians advanced faster and farther than anyone expected. He wrote that the experience had taught him that sometimes innovation comes from unexpected places. Sometimes the people everyone underestimates are the ones who change everything. Other American officers followed Bradley's lead. They gave lectures at military schools describing the Canadian tactics. They wrote articles for professional journals. Slowly, the historical record began to properly credit what had happened at Juno Beach. By the 1950s, military historians were calling it one of the most successful amphibious assaults in history. The broader lesson went beyond just military tactics. What happened at Juno Beach demonstrated something important about innovation and human nature. The people who are most likely to try radical new approaches are often those who have the most to prove. The Canadians had been dismissed as colonial troops. They had suffered the disaster at Dieppe. They carried the weight of low expectations. That weight did not crush them. Instead, it motivated them to find a better way. This pattern appears throughout history. The outsiders, the underdogs, the ones who are underestimated often become the innovators. They have less invested in the old ways of doing things. They have more to gain from trying something new. They are willing to take risks that established powers will not take. The Canadians at Juno Beach were not the first to demonstrate this principle, and they would not be the last. The lessons of Juno Beach remain relevant today. Modern military doctrine still emphasizes momentum in offensive operations. The idea of speed through the danger zone is now taught in every military academy in the world, but the applications go beyond warfare. In business, in science, in art, the same principle applies. Sometimes the fastest way through a difficult situation is straight through it, not around it. Sometimes maintaining forward momentum is safer than stopping to be cautious. The story also teaches us about the danger of underestimating people. The American and British commanders who dismissed the Canadians as inexperienced colonials were proven wrong within hours. Their assumptions about who could innovate and who could not were shattered by reality. Today, we still fall into the same trap. We assume that innovation comes from prestigious institutions or established experts. We overlook the people on the margins, the ones with something to prove. Juno Beach reminds us to question those assumptions. Rod Keller died in 1954 at the age of 52. His health never fully recovered from the wounds he received at Caen. At his funeral, a small group of veterans from the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division served as pallbearers. They were the men who had stormed Juno Beach 10 years earlier. They knew what Keller had done for them. They knew that his tactics had saved lives. They knew that he had given them a chance when others expected them to fail. In the decades since, Historians have continued to study D-Day. They have written thousands of books and articles. They have analyzed every aspect of the invasion, and increasingly they point to Juno Beach as the tactical masterpiece of the operation. Not because it was the bloodiest, not because it involved the most troops, but because it demonstrated that courage combined with innovation can overcome obstacles that seem impossible. The final lesson of Juno Beach is perhaps the most important. National pride, when channeled properly, can be an incredible force. The Canadian soldiers on that beach were not just fighting for victory. They were fighting to prove that their nation belonged among the great powers. They were fighting to show that being underestimated was a mistake. They were fighting for respect. And that desire for respect, that determination to prove themselves, gave them an edge that no amount of equipment or training could provide. Sometimes having something to prove is the greatest tactical advantage of all. The Germans at Juno Beach had better fortifications, more artillery, and years of preparation. But they faced an enemy that refused to be stopped. They faced soldiers who would rather die moving forward than live with the shame of failure. That spirit, that determination, that refusal to accept limits is what changed the course of history on June 6, 1944. And it remains a lesson worth remembering today.
January 8th, 2005, 02:43 GMT, 525 feet below the Pacific surface, 364 nautical miles southeast of Guam. The inertial navigation system indicates USS San Francisco, Los Angeles-class attack submarine SSN 711, is transiting at flank speed, maximum velocity for the pressure hull at depth, crossing the Caroline Islands region toward a scheduled port call. The temperature is 29 degrees. Thermocline layers are typical for the area, and sonar performance is nominal. No contacts, no acoustic anomalies, no evidence of surveillance or pursuit. The submarine's crew is relaxed. Some are in berthing, others on watch. The ordinary rhythm of open ocean navigation, broken only by the hum of the main propulsion system, the uneven vibration of the propeller shaft, and the faint smell of warm oil and amine coolant drifting through ventilation ducts. The command leadership expects the transit to remain uneventful. The only deviation from normal procedure is the use of charts with incomplete bathymetric data. No evidence of significant undersea obstacles marked along the projected route. The navigation party, satisfied with the absent sonar returns and visually confirmed waypoints, has cleared the submarine's course. The watch officer's final status check finds no anomalies in depth, trim, or ballast conditions. The atmosphere is routine, the environment all but featureless, the risks of the open Pacific seemingly remote. Los Angeles-class submarines like San Francisco are the most numerous attack submarines ever built. Launched in 1979, San Francisco displaces 6,080 tons submerged, measures 362 feet in length, and is powered by a single S6G pressurized water reactor, generating 38,000 shaft horsepower through geared turbines, driving a 7-bladed screw. The class is renowned for speed, 33 knots at flank, capable of outrunning any surface warship and matching most Soviet nuclear submarines, stealth, and advanced sonar and weapon systems that allow the boat to conduct surveillance, anti-ship, and anti-submarine operations across oceanic distances. The pressure hull construction, using HY80 steel, provides test depth of 900 feet, well beyond San Francisco's current operating depth. The modular design incorporates noise reduction features, including double shell construction, anechoic tile cladding, and isolation mounts for noisy machinery, all intended to minimize the boat's acoustic signature during covert operations. The crew is trained for immediate response to flooding, fire, or loss of propulsion, but no situation demands instantaneous reaction to an immovable underwater obstacle, for the seafloor is never considered an imminent threat when the correct charts are in use and the marine environment is calm. Commander Kevin Mooney, the submarine's commanding officer, has a reputation for competence and a record of successful deployments. His responsibilities include ensuring the safety of 137 crew members, delivering the submarine to its assigned patrol zone, and executing the mission with zero risk of catastrophic mishap. The stakes of any navigation error at maximum speed are extreme. The force of a collision with immovable terrain is proportional to the square of velocity, meaning that an encounter at flank speed generates 4 times the impact energy of a collision at half speed. The physics of underwater terrain also favors the seafloor. Any contact with exposed rock or coral will result in instantaneous deceleration, transmitting shockwaves through the hull, rupturing internal compartments, and risking immediate loss of positive buoyancy. The Los Angeles-class design includes multiple watertight bulkheads, compartmentalized systems, redundant emergency blow capability, and the ability to survive limited hull breaches. But these systems are not designed to prevent or mitigate damage from collisions with solid terrain. The only defense against such hazards is rigorous navigation, constant monitoring of sonar and charts, and strict adherence to voyage planning protocols. San Francisco's navigation equipment is standard for the era, a modernized inertial navigation system supplemented by LORAN and GPS, an integrated charting system, and a suite of passive and active sonars, including the hull-mounted BQQ-5 array and towed TB16-23 arrays. The submarine's voyage plan is based on the latest published bathymetric data, but the electronic charts available to the navigation party do not indicate any significant undersea mountains or seamounts along the primary transit route. The boat's course is plotted to avoid restricted operating zones and to provide ample water depth, with the mine and obstacle avoidance sonar set to detect submerged hazards at short range. No active sonar is used. Standard protocol for undeclared transit in international waters excludes the transmission of detectable sonar pings, so the submarine relies entirely on the sensitivity of passive arrays and the accuracy of digital charts. The navigation team is confident. The vessel is at sea, submerged, and presumed to be in open water. The transit is proceeding as planned. The crew expects the next major event to be the arrival in port, not a disaster that will test the limits of the submarine's engineering and the crew's survival training. 72 nautical miles from the planned course, an uncharted seamount rises from the ocean floor, formed by tectonic forces millions of years ago, and missed on the most recent published charts. The mountain's peak is 200 feet below the surface, its western face exceeding 2,000 feet in height, its bulk stretching across nearly a mile of seafloor. The submarine's course inadvertently deviates slightly from the primary transit route, traveling at 33 knots, flank speed, when the bow enters the shadow zone of the seamount. The inertial navigation system does not issue a warning. The MAL, mine and obstacle avoidance sonar, designed for small, shallow, or metallic hazards, does not register the geological feature. The electronic chart browser, referenced every few minutes by the navigation team, provides no evidence of danger. The submarine continues at maximum speed, crossing the thermocline and descending into the high-pressure, low-visibility environment of the deep Pacific, where the only indicators of trouble are the subtle changes in water temperature and the faintest vibration in the hull, signaling the proximity of solid terrain. The crew is unaware that the external environment is about to change. The ocean floor, once a benign feature, is about to become the most lethal object in the submarine's path. The vessel is on a collision course with a formation that occupies an area too large and too deep to avoid by any maneuver. San Francisco will not see it, hear it, or detect it until the instant of impact. The composition of the seamount, a mix of basalt and coral, creates a terrain that is dense and immovable, unlike the soft sediment or muddy seabed typical in most navigational hazards. The mountain extends vertically from the ocean floor, rising to the seamount, its flank facing the direction from which the submarine is approaching. The high calcium content of the coral cap and the basaltic bedrock below give the formation exceptional strength, capable of withstanding the force of even the largest vessels without yielding or breaking. The geological data available to the Navy does not reflect this feature, and the digital charting system does not update the crew to the presence of such a hazard. The mine and obstacle avoidance sonar, designed primarily for detecting metallic objects or submerged minefields, fails to pick up the massive, irregular contours of the geological formation. The submarine's passive sonar, tuned to detect the acoustic signatures of other vessels, does not register the silent, immovable danger that lies ahead. The crew completes routine checks. The sonar operator reports clear returns, nothing unusual. The helm officer marks the passage of each waypoint, confirming the vessel's progress toward Guam. The navigation officer and junior officer review the electronic chart, double-checking the plotted course, running calculations for the remaining distance to the next major waypoint, and ensuring the vessel's trim and depth match the ideal profile for transit at flank speed. The bridge is a model of submarine efficiency. The watch section exchanges crisp, matter-of-fact status updates. The crew is alert and focused. No emergencies are reported, no alarms sound, and the atmosphere is one of routine professionalism. The only deviation is the absence of any visual or sonar indication of the seamount. The only thing that has not gone according to plan is the omission of hazard data from the digital charts. The crew is operating in what they believe is open water, a vast, uncharted swath of ocean where the risk of collision with fixed terrain is negligible. The Los Angeles-class digital navigation suite used in 2005 was a marked improvement over the analog systems of previous decades. The integration of GPS, inertial navigation, and digital charting provided sub-meter position accuracy and automated detection of previously charted underwater hazards. However, the system was only as good as its data. The conversion of official Navy charts into digital formats occasionally retained errors or omissions, especially in regions where hydrographic surveys were infrequent or where the terrain was too complex to model accurately. The navigational procedures required manual cross-checking of electronic, paper, and charted databases, but the workload and the pace of transits at maximum speed sometimes led to a false sense of security in the absence of system warnings. The electronic charting suite, which should have been the last line of defense against navigational error, did not display any red flags, nor did it indicate the presence of a mountain that would have been visible on other charts possessed by the submarine, a discrepancy that would come to light only after the collision, raising questions about the assumptions that underpinned navigation at sea and the trust placed in automated systems. The communication between the bridge, control room, and sonar tech is minimal. The submarine is in an open, non-threatening environment, so most conversation is professional, technical, and focused on the next steps in the voyage. The commanding officer, Kevin Mooney, monitors the bridge from a nearby station, stepping out of the command room to check the progress of the transit, assume watch, or confer with the officer of the deck. The engineering crew is alert, but not alarmed. The propulsion system is performing within expected parameters, and the reactor is running at nominal power, producing enough energy to drive the boat at flank speed through the deep Pacific. The air temperature is comfortable, the humidity is moderate, the sound of the air conditioning diffusing the scent of oil and the slight metallic taste of amine that lingers from the missile tubes and machinery spaces. The lights in the control room are a muted yellow, the dials and analog gauges casting soft shadows. The only dramatic lighting coming from the red battle station lights that would illuminate in the event of an emergency, but they are not activated. The submarine is living up to its reputation for speed, reliability, and stealth. The clock ticks past 02:45, and the submarine's position is only minutes from the scheduled next waypoint. The crew is expecting a standard reliefs and watch rotation, the routine continuation of their transit, and the approach to the territorial waters of Guam sometime the next day. The navigation team begins planning for the next segment of the voyage, discussing the final approach, verifying communication protocols with the port authorities, and going through the checklist for in-port procedures. The submarine is 2.5 days from the commencement of the port visit, and the mood is relaxed, typical of the end of a transit. The crew knows that the port visit will bring familiar routines, shore leave, maintenance, resupply. But for now, their only task is to complete the final leg of the transit without incident. The control room is a study in calm efficiency, the dials and gauges reporting normal values, the sonar operator listening for the routine sounds of the deep Pacific, the navigation officer marking the passage of time and distance, the crew expecting the period of open ocean transit to end without surprise. The atmosphere is one of disciplined routine, the confidence born of experience, and the trust in the vessel's systems and the available charts. Nothing in the submarine suggests that the next moment will be anything but the continuation of the ordinary. At precisely 02:43 GMT, on January 8, 2005, USS San Francisco's bow strikes the granite and coral face of the uncharted seamount at flank speed, 33 knots, while submerged at 525 feet depth. The impact delivers a force equivalent to a high-speed train derailment, the entire 362-foot hull shuddering as kinetic energy converts instantaneously into structural deformation. The sonar dome, the bulbous fiberglass housing protecting the BQQ-5 bow sonar array, collapses on contact, crushed to fragments in milliseconds as the submarine's 7,000-ton mass drives forward into immovable rock. The forward ballast tanks rupture, steel plates buckling inward as seawater floods the external tanks designed to control the submarine's buoyancy. The collision tears away sections of the outer hull, exposes internal piping, and creates a massive entry point for Pacific seawater rushing into spaces never intended to flood. The submarine's forward momentum ceases instantly, but the stern continues moving forward, lifting the propeller and rudder assembly partially clear of the water as the bow embeds itself against the seamount's western face. Inside the submarine, the crew experiences a deceleration that human bodies cannot withstand without protective restraint. Personnel standing in passageways are thrown forward into bulkheads, equipment racks, and piping with enough force to break bones and fracture skulls. Machinist's mate, second class. Joseph Allen Ashley, 24 years old, from Akron, Ohio, is standing in the forward section when the impact occurs. He is hurled multiple feet through the air, striking his head against steel with catastrophic force. The collision injures 98 crew members, 90% of San Francisco's complement, creating a mass casualty event in an environment where advanced medical care is impossible. 23 sailors sustain injuries requiring immediate medical attention, broken bones, spinal fractures, severe lacerations, and head trauma that ranges from concussions to basilar skull fractures. The submarine's independent duty corpsman, the sole medical professional aboard, is one of the few uninjured, and his attention is immediately drawn to the two most critically wounded. Ashley has suffered a massive cerebral injury associated with a basilar skull fracture. The bone at the base of the skull has fractured, and intracranial bleeding is causing rapidly increasing pressure on his brain. He loses consciousness instantly and never regains it. The IDC begins emergency treatment, but the injury is inevitably fatal without immediate neurosurgical intervention that cannot be provided aboard the submarine or anywhere within hundreds of miles. The control room erupts into controlled chaos as damage reports flood in from every compartment. The diving officer reports loss of forward buoyancy. 2/3 of the forward main ballast tanks are compromised, and seawater is flooding the external hull spaces. The engineering watch reports the S6G reactor has automatically scrammed, shut down, in response to the violent shock, cutting off the primary power source and leaving the submarine dependent on battery power and the emergency diesel generator. Commander Kevin Mooney, standing in the control room when the impact occurred, immediately orders emergency surfacing procedures. "Blow all ballast tanks. Surface the boat." The order is transmitted to the ballast control panel, where crew members activate the emergency blow system. Compressed air stored in high-pressure tanks is released into the main ballast tanks, displacing water and creating positive buoyancy. But the forward tanks are ruptured, and compressed air vents uselessly into the ocean rather than displacing water. The submarine begins to rise, but the angle is steep, Bow down, stern up, and the rate of ascent is slower than normal because only the aft ballast tanks are functioning. The crew fights to maintain control as the submarine pitches at an angle that makes movement through passageways treacherous and threatens to cause additional injuries as unsecured equipment and personnel slide forward. The emergency diesel generator is started, providing electrical power to critical systems, including lighting, ventilation, and the low-pressure air blower, a system normally used to ventilate ballast tanks, but now pressed into emergency service. The engineering crew devises an unconventional solution: rig the diesel exhaust and the LP blower to blow simultaneously into the compromised forward ballast tanks, using diesel exhaust pressure to supplement the emergency blow system. The procedure is not in any manual, but it works. The additional pressure helps force water out of the damaged tanks, increasing buoyancy just enough to keep the forward hatches above the waterline when the submarine surfaces. San Francisco breaches the surface at 03:15 GMT, 32 minutes after the collision, her bow riding low, her sail and aft sections elevated, seawater streaming from ruptured hull plating. The crew opens the bridge hatch, and the watch officer emerges into the pre-dawn darkness of the Pacific, confirming visual contact with the horizon and transmitting the first distress call. Submiss, USS San Francisco, collision with underwater object, 1 critical casualty, multiple injuries, request immediate assistance. The message is received by Commander, Submarine Force Pacific at Pearl Harbor, and within minutes, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Galveston Island and the military Sealift Command vessel USNS Stockholm are diverted to provide assistance. The independent duty corpsman spends the next 24 hours focused primarily on Joseph Ashley, attempting every intervention within his capability to stabilize the critically injured sailor. 2 crew members with previous medical experience assist, treating the dozens of other injured personnel, applying splints to fractured limbs, suturing lacerations, administering pain medication, and monitoring vital signs. The injuries requiring the most urgent attention include 9 concussions, 23 head or face lacerations, multiple fractures, including shoulders, ribs, and spinal vertebrae, and 1 patient with a pneumocephaly, air trapped inside the skull from the basilar fracture. Medical advice is provided remotely from the command center at Submarine Force Pacific in Pearl Harbor, where a rotating watch of Navy physicians monitors the situation continuously. The most time-intensive tasking is arranging care for Ashley. The situation is complicated because there is no neurosurgeon in the territory of Guam at the time of the collision. Plans are set in motion for a neurosurgeon to be flown from Okinawa, Japan, with equipment, while a general surgeon is identified to escort Ashley via helicopter from the submarine to Naval Hospital Guam, once San Francisco reaches closer proximity to Guam. If you'd like to explore this story in greater depth, I've included links in the description to books like Blind Man's Bluff and military medicine journals that provided crucial details you won't find anywhere else. These recommendations support the channel and help us continue producing these deep dive investigations. And I'm grateful to everyone who chooses to learn more through those resources. San Francisco limps toward Guam under her own power, escorted by Coast Guard and Navy vessels, making slow progress with damaged ballast tanks and limited propulsion from the emergency diesel. The crew maintains continuous damage control, monitoring the integrity of the pressure hull, pumping water from flooded compartments, and ensuring the nuclear reactor remains in a safe shutdown condition. The atmosphere aboard is tense. Every crewman knows that the submarine came within minutes of sinking, that only the crew's training and the structural integrity of the HY-80 steel pressure hull prevented total loss. On January 9, 2005, 27 hours after the collision, machinist's mate, second class Joseph Allen Ashley, dies from his injuries. Despite every effort by the submarine's medical team and consultation with physicians ashore, the severity of his head trauma makes survival impossible without immediate neurosurgical intervention that could not be provided in time. Ashley is the only fatality, but his death transforms the incident from a near disaster into a tragedy that will haunt every member of San Francisco's crew. USS San Francisco arrives at Apra Harbor, Guam, on January 10, 2005, 54 hours after the collision, where 29 injured crew members are transported immediately to Naval Hospital Guam for evaluation and treatment. 3 sailors are admitted overnight, 1 with pneumocephaly, zygomatic bone fractures and rib fractures, 1 with a lumbar spine fracture, and 1 with a fractured thyroid cartilage. The remaining 26 are treated and released, though many will require months of physical therapy and medical monitoring. The submarine is moved into dry dock for damage assessment, and the extent of the structural destruction becomes apparent. The sonar dome is completely destroyed, reduced to fragments scattered across the ocean floor 400 miles away. The forward ballast tanks are ruptured and buckled, with sections of outer hull plating torn away or deformed beyond repair. The bow shows massive deformation, steel plates compressed and wrinkled from the impact, the leading edge of the keel ground flat where it struck the seamount. Remarkably, the inner pressure hull is intact. The double hull construction of the Los Angeles class, with an outer hull separated from the inner pressure hull by ballast tanks and structural spaces, absorbed the impact energy, preventing catastrophic flooding of habitable compartments. The nuclear reactor compartment shows no damage. The reactor coolant system remains intact, and there is no release of radioactivity. The submarine's survival is attributed to the strength of HY-80 steel construction, the effectiveness of watertight compartmentalization, and the crew's immediate response to the emergency. The investigation into the collision begins immediately, led by Commander, Submarine Force Pacific, with the findings documented in a 124-page report completed in May 2005. The investigation determines that San Francisco struck a seamount that did not appear on the primary digital navigation chart in use at the time of the collision. However, other charts in San Francisco's possession, specifically older paper charts covering the same region, clearly displayed a navigation hazard marked as discolored water, a hydrographic notation indicating the probable presence of a shallow seamount or coral formation. The navigation team failed to review those charts adequately and transfer pertinent hazard data to the digital chart being used for primary navigation, violating relevant directives and the ship's own navigation procedures. The investigation concludes that if San Francisco's leaders and watch teams had complied with requisite procedures and exercised prudent navigation practices, the grounding would most likely have been avoided. The failure is attributed not to equipment malfunction or incomplete chart coverage, but to procedural non-compliance. The crew possessed the information necessary to avoid the hazard, but did not cross-reference sources as required. Commander Kevin Mooney is relieved of command on May 19, 2005, and issued a letter of reprimand. The Navy acknowledges Mooney's otherwise remarkably good record, but ultimate responsibility for navigational safety rests with the commanding officer. The investigation finds that several critical navigational and voyage planning procedures were not being implemented aboard San Francisco, and Mooney, as commanding officer, is accountable for ensuring crew compliance with those procedures. The immediate hours following the collision are dominated by damage control, medical triage, and the desperate effort to keep San Francisco afloat. The forward compartments are completely flooded. The sonar dome is crushed, and the bow plating is crumpled inward like aluminum foil compressed by a hydraulic press. The watertight bulkheads hold, barely, preventing the flooding from spreading aft and allowing the crew to maintain buoyancy through the emergency ballast blow system that forces compressed air into the main ballast tanks, displacing seawater and lifting the submarine toward the surface. The medical response is immediate and overwhelming. 98 crew members are injured, 23 so severely they cannot stand watch or perform duties during the emergency transit back to Guam. Machinist's mate. Second Class Joseph Allen Ashley, 24 years old, dies from injuries sustained when the impact threw him headfirst into machinery in the forward engineering spaces. fracturing his skull and causing traumatic brain injury that proves fatal despite immediate medical intervention. Ashley's death marks him as the only fatality, but the toll on the crew is staggering. Broken bones, spinal injuries, severe lacerations, concussions, and internal trauma from impacts with equipment, bulkheads, and pipes during the instantaneous deceleration. The submarine's medical personnel, hospital corpsmen trained for combat trauma, work frantically to stabilize the critically injured, administering pain medication, splinting fractures, and monitoring for signs of internal bleeding or neurological damage. The crew transforms berthing areas and the crew's mess into improvised triage centers, with the most severely wounded receiving priority care while others wait with lesser injuries. Commander Mooney makes the decision to surface immediately, despite the risk of further hull damage. The submarine breaks the surface at approximately 03:15 GMT, less than 30 minutes after the collision, listing heavily to port with the bow submerged and the sail canted at an unnatural angle. The crew establishes communication with US Pacific Fleet headquarters, transmitting an emergency distress signal and requesting immediate assistance. The transit back to Guam is conducted at minimal speed, with continuous monitoring of the damaged bow compartments for signs of progressive flooding. Surface vessels are dispatched to escort San Francisco, providing medical support and damage control assistance as the submarine limps across 364 nautical miles of open ocean with a crushed bow and a crew struggling to manage both the physical damage to the vessel and the psychological trauma of the collision. The voyage takes more than 24 hours, with crew members rotating through damage control watches, medical care shifts, and the grim task of securing Joseph Ashley's remains for transport ashore. San Francisco arrives at Apra Harbor, Guam, on January 10, 2005, where emergency dry docking reveals the full extent of the damage. The bow is destroyed from the sonar dome back to the forward torpedo room, approximately 60 feet of the submarine's structure compressed, twisted, and rendered unsalvageable. The pressure hull shows stress fractures extending aft from the impact zone, and the main ballast tanks are ruptured in multiple locations. Naval engineers initially question whether the submarine can be repaired, or whether she will be declared a constructive total loss and decommissioned. The investigation into the collision begins within days, led by Vice Admiral Jonathan Greenert, commander of the US 7th Fleet. The inquiry focuses on navigation procedures, chart usage, command oversight, and the sequence of decisions that led the submarine to transit at flank speed through waters where hazards were marked on available charts, but not transferred to the digital navigation system in use. The investigation reveals a cascade of failures: procedural lapses, inadequate chart review, failure to cross-reference multiple data sources, and command decisions that prioritize speed over comprehensive hazard assessment. The critical finding centers on Chart DMA 81023, a Defense Mapping Agency chart that clearly showed an area of discolored water at the location where San Francisco struck the seamount. Discolored water is a standard cartographic indication of shallow features, underwater mountains, or coral formations that pose navigation hazards. The chart was aboard the submarine, stored in a drawer in the navigation space, but was never consulted during the voyage planning process because the navigation team relied exclusively on electronic chart E2202, which did not contain the hazard notation. The navigation supervisor had briefly examined DMA 81023 during the planning phase, but dismissed it as inferior in detail compared to the electronic chart, and returned it to storage without transferring the hazard information. The assistant navigator spent 15 minutes reviewing electronic chart E2202, but failed to notice the absence of hazard markings in the transit area. Commander Mooney, when questioned during the investigation, stated that he expected his navigation team to examine every available chart and transfer hazard data between sources, but he did not personally verify that this procedure had been followed and did not ask whether alternative charts existed for the transit route. The Navy's official investigation report concludes that several critical navigational and voyage planning procedures, were not implemented aboard San Francisco, constituting a breach of standing orders and standard submarine navigation protocols. The report states that Mooney failed to appreciate potential hazards, operated at excessive speed given the uncharted nature of the waters, and failed to review charts adequately. The investigation also faults the submarine squadron for failing to provide adequate oversight of San Francisco's navigation performance and for not correcting previously identified deficiencies in open ocean navigation procedures aboard the vessel. On February 13, 2005, Commander Kevin Mooney is relieved of command and issued a letter of reprimand, a career-ending punishment that effectively terminates any prospect of future promotion or command positions. 6 other crew members receive non-judicial punishment at captain's mast hearings, found guilty of hazarding a vessel and dereliction of duty, resulting in reduction in rank and punitive letters of reprimand. Vice Admiral Greenert's statement acknowledges Mooney's prior record. Although the grounding incident compelled me to punish and remove him from command, in my opinion, it does not negate 19 years of exemplary service. 20 other officers and enlisted personnel receive commendations for their actions during the crisis, including the Meritorious Service Medal, Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, and Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal, recognizing the extraordinary damage control efforts, medical response, and seamanship that saved the submarine and 136 lives. The dichotomy between punishment for the navigation failures and recognition for the emergency response reflects the Navy's dual imperatives: accountability for errors that endanger vessels and acknowledgement of heroism that prevents catastrophic loss. The decision to repair San Francisco, rather than decommission her, is driven by the recent refueling of her nuclear reactor core, providing sufficient fuel for operation until 2017, and making repair economically viable despite the extensive damage. Temporary repairs conducted in Guam restore watertight integrity and provide sufficient forward buoyancy for the submarine to transit under her own power to Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, Washington via Pearl Harbor, arriving on August 26, 2005. The repair project involves the unprecedented surgical removal of the entire bow section from recently decommissioned USS Honolulu, SSN 718, cutting more than 1 million pounds of forward ballast tanks, sonar sphere, and pressure hull from Honolulu, and grafting them onto San Francisco's truncated hull. The process requires precise alignment, extensive welding, structural reinforcement, and recertification of the pressure hull to ensure the hybrid vessel meets operational safety standards. San Francisco undocks on October 10, 2008, completing sea trials in April 2009, and shifting home port to Naval Base Point Loma, San Diego, California. But the submarine never fully returns to frontline operational status. The collision and the hull grafting leave subtle structural anomalies, ripples and stress patterns along the length of the hull that limit the vessel's maximum depth and operational tempo. San Francisco spends her remaining years primarily as a training platform rather than a combat deployable asset, conducting exercises off the California coast and supporting submarine warfare training programs. If this investigation into USS San Francisco and the crew who survived one of the most catastrophic collisions in submarine history has moved you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Cold War Chronicles, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story from the invisible war. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, or if you or your family members served aboard submarines. Your stories and memories are part of preserving this history. Every like, every comment, every subscription helps these forgotten stories reach more people who need to hear them. You are part of ensuring these heroes and their sacrifices are not forgotten. The lessons learned from the San Francisco collision reverberate throughout the submarine force, prompting immediate revisions to navigation procedures, chart management protocols, and command oversight requirements. The Navy mandates cross-referencing of all available charts during voyage planning, requires explicit command-level verification that hazard data has been transferred between chart sources and implements additional training for navigation teams, emphasizing the limitations of digital charting systems. The incident demonstrates that automation, no matter how advanced, cannot replace human judgment and procedural discipline, that trust in electronic systems must be balanced by verification against multiple independent sources. The human cost extends beyond the immediate casualties. Joseph Ashley's family receives the news that their son, who joined the Navy to serve his country and pursue a career in submarine engineering, died in a preventable accident caused by navigation errors and procedural failures. The 98 injured crew members face months of recovery, some with permanent disabilities, spinal injuries that require surgery, traumatic brain injuries that cause cognitive impairment, psychological trauma from the violence of the collision, and the terror of believing the submarine might sink with all hands. Commander Mooney, despite the letter of reprimand and relief from command, continues his naval career in non-command positions, eventually retiring at the rank of captain after 31 years of service. His legacy is complicated. A competent officer with an exemplary record whose single failure of oversight during one critical voyage planning session resulted in disaster. The 6 crew members punished alongside him face the end of their advancement prospects, their careers effectively terminated by the determination that they hazarded a vessel through dereliction of duty. On May 11, 2017, USS San Francisco is placed in commission special status, stand down, for conversion to a moored training ship, a 32-month process that strips the submarine of operational systems and converts her into a pierside trainer for future submarine crews. The conversion is completed in mid-2021, and San Francisco is relocated from Norfolk to Charleston before being officially decommissioned on May 15, 2022, ending 42 years of service that included countless successful deployments, overshadowed by the single catastrophic event on January 8, 2005. The broader question raised by San Francisco's collision is whether the increasing complexity and automation of submarine systems creates complacency among crews who trust electronic displays without verifying the underlying data. The collision occurred not because the information was unavailable, but because the procedural discipline required to access and cross-reference that information was not maintained. The seamount was on a chart aboard the submarine. The hazard data was documented. The navigation team simply failed to look. This is Cold War Chronicles. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the invisible war, please subscribe and turn on notifications. We have only just scratched the surface of the secrets buried beneath the ice. Thank you for ensuring that Machinist's Mate Second Class, Joseph Allen Ashley, and the 137 crew members of USS San Francisco are not forgotten. Their ordeal, caused by errors in judgment, but survived through courage and training, reminds us that even in the most advanced vessels, operated by the most professional crews, the margin between routine transit and catastrophe can be measured in the failure to consult a single chart stored in a drawer. They served. They survived. And one gave his life. Their story deserves to be remembered not as a cautionary tale alone, but as testament to the resilience of submariners who face dangers both expected and unforeseen.